Hello everyone, welcome back to another session by K21 Academy. Today our expert will be talking about domain 2, that is deploy and manage Azure compute resources. So let's dive in.
Deploy and manage Azure compute resources, right? Domain 2, we know Azure compute resources. We are very much familiar now with the Azure compute resources. The main resource is Azure virtual machine. So what all things we are going to see here? Automate deployment for Azure VMs by using Azure Resource Manager Templates. This is basically the ARM template that it is talking about, right? I have told you guys what is the uses of ARM template, how you can use the ARM template, and ARM template can be used to deploy any resource on Azure. But here they are specifically talking about virtual machines, so that is fine, right? How to configure your VMs, create and configure containers. We have thoroughly and in-depth went through how containers exactly works, what all different functionalities are related to containers, procedures related to containers, container images, container registries, right? So we have gone through very much in depth in our I think last to last week we have done that, right? Monitor and troubleshoot virtual networking, which we have already covered, but it is specifically talking about your virtual machine, so we'll see that. Create and configure app services. So I have also showed and in depth showed you how app services will work, what all things are there. We'll just do a quick recap of those things. So let's see. Implement VMs on Windows and Linux, right? Azure Virtual Machine is one of the several types of on-demand scalable computing resources that Azure offers, right? We know when they are talking about scalable, right? When they are talking about on-demand, you can create a virtual machines literally in 3 to 5 minutes. You can scale your number of virtual machines just by setting up few things. When I'm talking about that, when I'm talking about specifically about virtual machine scale set, right? That is what it is actually telling. And Azure VM gives you a flexibility of virtualizations without having to buy and maintain physical hardware that runs, right? On that it runs. So this is what the major advantage of cloud computing which we are looking out for, right? And if you guys remember, I went through an in-depth, told you guys what this local drive is or temp drive, how exactly it will be there inside the data center, and where this OS disk, this VHD and data disk will be there, right? And we know that this VHD is the extension of all Azure data disks or operating system disks, and these are managed disks, right? So managed disks is like you don't have to manage these, like the infrastructure of these disks in the backend. Azure will do that. And you can also go for unmanaged disk, right? I showed you guys how to do that. Everything has been covered. I'm just recapping it, nothing else. Azure Resource Manager, in the last class I have discussed about what is Azure Resource Manager Template. Azure Resource Manager Template is a block of code that defines the infrastructure and configuration to your project, and it is basically declarative. It's declarative. You just declare this is what I want, right? And it will be in JSON language, right? JSON is basically nothing but key value pair, right? So this is how JSON language will be basically written, right? These templates use declarative syntax to let you define your deployment in form of JSON. Full form of JSON is JavaScript object notation files. All the resources and their properties are defined in this template. So this is the ARM template, and you will, by using the Azure portal, I showed you from where you can deploy it. Directly deploy it over a resource group, and automatically your Azure account will get created, which you have mentioned here on your ARM template. And you can use this template in any number of times. You can use this template to create the same resource in different resource groups or in different subscriptions or in different Azure account itself, right? So this can be used over and over again. So that is where you will get the benefit of automating the things, right? You are automating the things. One more thing. So here, let's say this is your resource group, right? This is your resource group. Inside this resource group, you have created this virtual machine, two virtual machines, you have created a SQL database, you have created a storage account and everything. And what you want to do is like you want to replicate the same thing in three more virtual. There is a ask to create all these resources in three different resource groups, right? So what you can do, you can download the ARM template of this resource group and then deploy it in the second, in the third, in the fourth or fifth resource groups, in which you will get the same replica of or the same copy of resources that are part of this particular resource group. and this is where you are automating the things. Automation is happening by using Azure Resource Manager template. So that is what basically they are talking about, right? And that is where the main application of Azure Resource Manager will work, right? There is a question again, right, guys? So which one of the following describes best the format of Azure Resource Manager template? Select one. Markdown document with pointer table, yes. JSON document with key value pair, I just discussed. An XML document. Yeah, obviously the answer will be B because it's a JSON document with a key value pairs. That is what I just discussed like 2 minutes back. Then what we have in our domain 2.2, configure VMs. How to configure VM, I'm not going to tell you guys because you know it already, right? Whether you are running virtual machines on remote desktop services or Azure virtual desktops, different types of workloads require different session hosts virtual machines configuration. For best possible experience, scale your deployment depending upon the user's needs. So this is basically talking about what kind of application, what kind of workload that is running on that particular virtual machine. You can change the size of that particular virtual machine. If you want big size of that particular virtual machine, here just check out this particular link. You will get the different kinds of sizes we have already discussed. So I'm not going to go because lot of sizes are there, but virtual machine sizes are nothing but you are just going to change the configuration in the backend, and you are going to provide more amount of RAM and compute or less amount of RAM and compute. Eventually the number of data disks will also increase and decrease. IOPS will increase and decrease. So that is what we are doing. High availability of Azure resources. So there were two things when we are talking about high availability. There was something called local high availability and there is something called regional high availability. That's what we have discussed before. But let's see. High availability refers to set of technologies that minimize IT disruptions by providing business continuity of IT services through redundant, fault tolerant, or failover protected components inside the same data center. So this is when we are talking about the same data center, it is local high availability. That's what we are talking about. The data center resides within one Azure region. That's what we are talking about. When we are talking about disaster recovery, this is actually connecting your regional high availability with your disaster recovery. That also refers to minimizing the IT services disruption and their recovery, but across various data centers that might be hundreds of miles away from one another, right? So these two data centers are in two different regions itself, wherein we can fail over our services if one particular region itself goes down. In our case, data center might resides in various regions within the same geopolitical region. So when they are talking about same geopolitical region, they are talking about Asia continent, they are talking about Europe continent, or they are talking about complete America or USA continent, right? In locations and established by your customer. So that is what something which we are discussing. We have thoroughly and in-depth went through and understood when we are discussing about this high availability thing, right? So I'll just proceed further. Availability set. Inside the availability set, what things are there, right? There is something called fault domain, which are nothing but your server host where the server rack where your servers are running, right? And the other thing is inside the availability set, we have fault domain and we have update domain, right? So there is something called update domain also. These fault domains are what? These are your hosts. Inside this, I
Correct,
told you, like this will be host, and inside this, you will be having your servers, right? These are the
correct,
update servers. These servers
correct,
needs to get updated, right? That is where
correct.
you will add these servers to one group and you will update these servers, this particular update group or update domain first, and then you will go for the other update domain, so that servers which belongs to two different update domains should not go down at one particular point of time. That is what update domain is, right? So that is what availability set is. When we are talking about availability zone, in the same region we have multiple data centers which are at least 100 miles away from each other, right? 100 miles away from each other, separate power supply is there, right? Separate power supply will be there. So inside the same region, when we are talking about, for an example, central US, in central US we have three availability zones or four availability zones. Inside the central US, we have 4 different data centers which are at least 100 miles apart from each other. So Azure Availability Zone is a high availability offering that protects your application and data from data center failure, right? You need to understand, or you need to keep this word in mind. Data center failure in the same region, right? There are unique physical locations within an Azure regions. Each zone is made up of one or more data centers. So in one particular zone, we can say one data center will be there or more than one data center will be there. That's what will be there. Availability zone. One availability zone I'm talking about, right? The example of availability zones are Central US, East US 2, West US 2, West Europe, France Central, North Europe, Southeast Asia. So all these things where you can find different availability zones. So these are the regions in which you have availability zones available. Apart from these regions or few plus minus from this, other regions you don't have availability zones. You have data center, but you don't have availability zone feature, right? Disk encryption. So the disks that are attached to your virtual network can be encrypted. It will be encrypted. If you are not encrypting it, Azure will encrypt. What Azure will do? Azure will use something called as Azure storage encryption protects your data. So basically it will be Azure managed. It will use Azure managed key. Azure managed key to encrypt the data until and unless you are not specifically going inside your disk and you want to encrypt it from your end by using something called customer managed encryption. Okay, so there are two kinds of encryption for data disk encryption. First one is Azure managed and another one is customer managed. So Azure storage uses server side encryption. So this is the kind of encryption protocol or technology that Azure will use for encrypting your data disk. And what all things are there? Two things: Azure managed or customer managed encryption keys are there, which we can use to encrypt the data that is inside our data disk or the data that is inside our Azure storage account, whether it is in blob or whether it is on any other service. So that is what something that is there, right? VMSS, we understand what we can do. On demand, we can scale up the number of virtual machines that are present behind the virtual machine skill set, and we can also scale down the number of virtual machines depending upon a certain conditions that we will set inside our virtual machine skill set, so that the number of servers will also come down. Now, what kind of scaling is happening? Is it a horizontal scaling or is it a vertical scaling? Horizontal or vertical? What kind of scaling is happening in VMSS? Horizontal scaling is happening, right? Vertical scaling, what will happen? Size of the VM will increase. In turn, there will be a downtime related to it, right? So when you are changing size of your virtual machine needs to get restarted, right? It will get restarted. But in horizontal scaling, your virtual machine will exist and new virtual machine with the same things what is configured on this VM will get created, and it will share the amount of requests that will be coming into the picture or coming inside the virtual machine skill set, right? So that is where we should go for horizontal scaling, not for vertical scaling, right? For production environment or any environment, let's say in that case. Okay, it helps to create and manage a set of identical auto scaling virtual machines. The number of VM instances can increase and decrease based on the scheduled conditions, which we have created and also seen it, right? Auto scaling is a way to automatically scale up and down the number of compute resources that is being allocated to your application based on the needs. Same thing it's talking about. So create and configure containers, what we have here in the picture. So we have Azure Container Instances. Azure Container Instances is a Microsoft PaaS solutions that offers the fastest and simplest way to run a container in Azure without having to manage any underlying infrastructure. So if you're using this Azure Container Instances service, you just have to create this particular service and you have to tell, okay, using this particular Docker image, I want to create my container, right? So I want to create my container against this particular Docker image. That's what you have to do. You don't have to configure anything. If you guys remember, I created a Windows 10 virtual machines, then I configured lot of things inside that, and then I showed you how to create a Docker image, how to push it to Azure Container Registry, and then on that particular local PC also I ran that particular Docker image to show you how this is how container will run. But all these things will not be there if you are using Azure container instances. So you just have to create this Azure container instance. You have to tell use this Docker image, and it will in turn it will automatically create and run that particular container by using that particular Docker image. So that is what Azure container instance will basically do, right? Same as Docker registry, we can push our images to Azure Container Registry. I told you what is Azure Container Registry. It's nothing but it's an repository for keeping your Docker images, which is a private secure registry proposed by the Azure platform. So why Azure Container Registry name is there? Because it is a service which is actually there in Azure. So that is why Azure Container Registry, right? And Kubernetes, I have in depth discussed about how Kubernetes works, right? What is the work of this scheduler, controller, etcd, API server, and this is called as cluster master or on master server, right? Which will be managed by Azure and which will be completely free of cost. You don't have to pay any cost. What cost you have to pay? You have to pay cost for your nodes, which is nothing but virtual machine that is running in the backend, which will part of VMSS. I also showed it to you guys. Inside this, your containers will run. Containers will run inside what? It will run inside pods, right? That is how your containers will run, right? We can also connect. This is what I'm talking about, AKS networking part. So there are two kinds of networking that we have discussed: Azure CNI and Kubernetes. So these are different kind of AKS networking that you can use. First is Azure CNI, next one is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is, I think, by default. So which one is advanced? Azure CNI is the advanced one. So if you are leveraging Azure CNI, you can actually connect your Azure virtual network, which is already there, with this particular infrastructure with these nodes. And in turn, resources from this particular network can connect to your containers, to your pods, basically, to your pods inside which your containers will be running, right? So that is what exactly it is. So AK is a managed Kubernetes service in which master node is managed by Azure and users manage worker nodes, which is nothing but your virtual machines that are running in the backend, right? Users can use AKs to deploy, scale, and manage Docker containers and container based applications across a cluster of container hosts, right? So that is what it can do. So that is what AKS was. So let's see what is the question. You decide to move all your services to Azure Kubernetes Service. Which of the following component will contribute to your monthly Azure charges? Node virtual machines, right? So that is the answer, right? Because this is free. Pods will be running inside virtual machines and tables are part of network. Create and manage app services. So app services, when we are talking about, we are talking specifically here, we are specifically talking about web apps, right? For our AZ-104. There are other services also. I showed you example by using your application function apps also. You can go and see the recording. You'll be able to understand how I used it, right? So there were multiple app services that I used in that demo. Three services that comes under the umbrella of Azure App Services are web apps, which we had discussed, mobile apps, right, which is part of one another course, right? And there is something called function apps, which is part of AZ 303 and 304. That is what it is. So we are focusing on this. So let's see what else is there. Azure Web Apps. Azure Web Apps is a service that helps us in developing the user interactive, multifunctional, secured, scalable, and highly reliable application, which is nothing but your website that you want to run on Azure by using something called Azure Web App. All right. It is a platform that helps host web application by building, deploying, and running applications. So you just have to deploy your application over the web app. I showed you guys practically how to do that, right? Azure Web App comes under platform as a service. So it's a PaaS service. It's a PaaS service. So that is what it will. So traditional create server, install OS, install web service, and then install your application, and then it will happen. But here, hosting on web app, just create a web app, deploy your app code, and your app will come online. It will start working by using your public IP address, which in turn will give you a DNS name, which we can use as a URL to access our application, right? But in the backend, Azure is also doing the same thing over a service called Azure Service Fabric, right? Deployment slots of Azure. So we can use slots, we can create production slot, we can create staging slots, and when you want to deploy a new version of application, you will deploy it on staging slots, check it, test it, everything is fine, then swap the slot, right? Then production will become staging, staging will become production, and there will be very minimum downtime, next to 30 seconds to 1 minute, which is very less if you are talking about swapping the slots and upgrading the version of one particular website, right? So that's what you will get the feature. App services runs on default slot known as production slots and contain deployment slots to check the application's version, right? That's what it. Out of the instance created, one of them will always point to the default slot, and we can attempt swapping different instances with just one click. That is, you just need on click on swap. Now again, one example question is there. So you are administrating a production web app. The app requires scaling to 5 instances, 40 GB of storages, and a custom domain name, right? Which app plan service you should select? This app requires scaling to 5 instances in the backend, right? So here free, basic, and shared will run on shared resources in the backend, but in standard you will get 0 to 5 number of instances in the backend. Okay, there is premium also. First thing what you should see here is 5 instances. You will not get number of instances in these three. This is how you should make sure, like, okay, this option is not there, this option, then only you will come to the correct option, right?
So, guys, this was our expert from Team K21 Academy. And if in case you missed upon anything or if you could not understand anything from what our trainers explained, then we have something really special for you. We have our free class on Microsoft Azure Admin Certification for beginners along with some question and answers. Under this class, you'll be learning about who should learn Azure Cloud and why. We'll be learning about Azure Certification Roadmap for beginners and a lot of demos about Azure Core Services, more than 30 plus hands-on labs and whatnot. And if you want to register for this free class, then you just have to log on to k21academy.com/AZ-10402. So just now, let me just give you a demo for the same. Alright, so what you have to do is just open your browser and type k21academy.com/AZ-10402. After that, you'll be seeing a page like this. You just have to click on book your seats now. And after that, just select an event date when you're available, add your name, add your email address, add your phone number, and click on yes, save my seat now. Moving ahead, you'll be seeing this kind of link on the extreme right. Just save that link, add it to your calendars, and I'll see you in this class. Till then, take care and keep learning.